Hi, I'm Terence Como. I'm a medical doctor by training and involved in a range of businesses and initiatives, for-profit and non-profit, including healthcare, policy, strategy, and a range of leadership initiatives in South Africa and internationally. Over the last few days, I've watched the evolution of what was initially the views of my colleague Dr. Gray, and then other expressions of opinions and large amounts of criticism leveled against her as a volunteer expert on the Ministerial Advisory Committee in South Africa. I have no political direct affiliations. I do have certain political views. This is my individual perspective, speaking as a citizen and as a professional who understands some of these contexts in South Africa. The intention of this is to stimulate a discussion and get your view on what you think is really going on and what seems to be motivating the decisions made by our government in South Africa and other governments around the world. All of you would have noticed today being Sunday, the Sunday Times and other media have carried extensive coverage on the discussions, the perspectives shared by various advisors who sit in the committees to the minister, the president and other committees, and how decisions are being questioned and concerns being raised and a deliberation on where to from here. At this stage, we're still on lockdown, or as is commonly colloquially called, stage 3.9. But up front, I'd like to say I'm extremely grateful to President Ramaphosa and the Minister of Health and the other leading executives and policy and decision makers in South Africa for acting as expeditiously as they did, as effectively as they did, to begin with the lockdown, to begin with the necessary precautions, because we're dealing with uncertain times. We have never had such a crisis, not in South Africa, not in the world, not particularly in this context. And I'm very grateful because it's been beneficial to me as an individual, my family, our community, and as a country. There have been untold concerns and untold stresses attached to it because of the economic repercussions. But I know a risk-based decision was made, very rightly so, to protect the people of this country and so that we can protect lives over the economy and work towards an economic recovery. So government has put in great stimulus packages and support packages, and so has business and industry come to the party to say, we will stand together with government. We'll stand as one country, as one people, so that we can show to ourselves and the world of how unity can create great success in times of need. So I'm very thankful for that. And up front, I have no political interest in this discussion. And what I do want to ask is to maybe let's deliberate for a moment on how did we get here. I can tell you factually, although we know the COVID-19 or the coronavirus crisis has been around from a sort of November, December last year, it became more a world interest in January this year when other discussions took place. I was present in discussions with Swiss governments and other leaders around the world during the World Economic Forum in Davos. And Dr. Tedros and other leading experts were in discussions, in very small private panel discussions, many of which I attended. And at that point, it was essentially a Chinese concern, but the WHO had massive concerns around saying, what if this spreads and are we ready internationally? There was concern and there was policy decisions being made at that point. I know immediately after the discussions at Davos, Dr. Tedros was leaving to Geneva to participate in discussions around it. So I do think the WHO had also moved fairly quickly given the context of what was known at that time. In terms of where we are as a country, South Africa, the declaration of disaster took place when it was needed. There was a lot of deliberation in some academic circles of, is it a state of disaster or is it a state of emergency? And that I would leave to the legal minds and the experts in that space. I do have some views, but lest I be seen dabbling in the legal world, I would leave that to our expert colleagues who can share their expertise with us. I do believe, in my understanding, the purpose was to protect lives. So we arrived here as a country, as a people, as citizens, because the government decided, rightly so, to protect its people as a basis of a healthcare crisis. The disaster was to protect lives from an attack of a virus across the country as a pandemic, to protect the people of this country, and therefore the military was deployed and other significant initiatives and decisions were taken to protect the people of this country. So let's keep that frame in mind at the back of our mind as we deliberate on the rest of this discussion. If the aim, and it remains the primary reason of the decisions being made in the various regulations, because the context is many of these decisions have taken away various liberties which we all take for granted. But it was necessary so at the time the decisions were primarily made. And I'm not going to traverse into a discussion around that, lest it be seen as a political motive. But let's look for a moment at the experts who serve on the Ministerial Advisory Committees, the experts, myself included, and many other peers who participate in industry discussions, industry forums, which relate to the COVID crisis, and how we can all contribute through BSA, through BUSA, BLSA, a range of initiatives and organizations in South Africa, Africa, and the world to help support, protect lives, protect economies, and help people for a better life moving forward so that we can make sure we're in a better place when we get ahead of the pandemic and save as much lives as we can whilst managing and mitigating the implications of some of the decisions made. The experts on the various panels, including the Ministerial Advisory Committee, from what I understand, advise the minister and only provide advice and suggestions. So it's not making a political decision, it's providing various inputs. But they do it on a voluntary basis, and those voluntary opinions expressed based on their expertise as they were selected to serve in these committees is non-binding on the ministers, non-binding on the executive, and non-binding on our president. But quite often we've seen discussions in recent time, and Professor Salim Karim and other amazing colleagues have had discussions and presented factually so to the country to say a lot of the decisions that government is making is based on the scientific basis of the advice provided by these committees. So in the context, we have a pandemic which caused a declaration of disaster across the country for an extended period. There are various levels of lockdown that's been implemented. The attribution, in my understanding, is it's based on science, primarily medical science, and the related fields around that. But the focus is on this is a science-based decision to protect lives in a time of disaster because of the prevailing pandemic of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. Then begs the question when criticism is leveled at our colleagues, and I can tell you factually, I don't know Dr. Gray personally, nor do I have an interest in her perspectives, except understanding and asking, is there merit in what she said? And are other people asking the same questions? And very likely so, many others are asking. I think because of her stature and way she serves on these committees, there has been an attribution of seriousness to her expertise and what she's provided in her concerns raised. So then the question is then begged. If our focus is a healthcare decision based on healthcare needs to protect the country, what motivated the political decisions to be selective in releasing some goods versus others? Now, I can tell you factually, many people have asked me, well, then why no alcohol? And my view has been, to some extent, because when people drink alcohol, they socialize. And when they socialize, they let their guard down. They're less proactive and they're less aware of their concerns. And especially in communities, and I'm not saying because it's only poorer communities, but lower income communities have tighter blendings of where alcohol is sold, whether it be in shebeens or bottle stores or people drinking together in their communities, and that could lead to an accelerated rate of exposure in the context of a very high rate of HIV, TB, hypertension, other significant communicable and non-communicable but chronic and significant diseases in our African context. So again, it was a science-based opinion. But when we talk about science, very much like the Constitutional Court decided on the marijuana use in South Africa, government's perspective across all the ministries were based on, we say that marijuana or dagga is a gateway drug. But the Constitutional Court looked at the science, they looked at the basis and said, it's a historical discussion, and even the science does not support the decision that you need to criminalize the private use of marijuana in your private environment, and there was a massive discussion on the use of alcohol versus marijuana. So in this case, I've not seen the science, and I don't know anyone that has seen the science of government saying, we've taken a decision not to sell alcohol based on a solid scientific basis. The same questions are then raised on smoking, where we've had ministers and other colleagues say, well, smoking causes risks for corona and COVID crisis. Yes, the coronavirus primarily affects initially, and then the rest of the body, the respiratory system, which is a critical concern. Will smoking complicate it? It potentially can. Do we have a scientific basis to say don't smoke anyway because it can cause that? I'm yet to see the science behind that. And I think that is what stimulated some of the decisions and discussions from our esteemed colleagues on the Ministerial Advisory Committee. But we then ask, let's go further. And I walked into a mall without mentioning the brand, And you could buy some clothes because apparently it's winter related, but you couldn't buy t-shirts. I couldn't buy specific cargo pants that I needed to buy because it's been banded off and said you can't buy it. The question is why? What is the scientific basis of deciding what pants I need to wear or what shirt I need to wear and how that influences transmission? And if there is a policy decision on that, where's the science? I also ask and beg you to please enlighten me, because I struggle to understand how a science-based decision of declaration of disaster has been used to decide what we can wear, what we can buy, what we can eat, and what we can drink. Because I don't see the science behind some of these decisions. Some of the criticisms that I read last night before seeing the Sunday Times article were people saying Dr. Gray and the experts on the various committees who have now spoken out should stay in their lane. This decision is not a medical decision, it is an economic decision. So the Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition and the related esteemed members of our executive in the economic cluster, they making those decisions. The question is why? How do we take away constitutional rights to access to consume what I want to consume, when I want to consume it, and how I want to consume it, in a disaster that's health-based? So the health basis is the underlying factor. Protect people, save lives. That is why we've enacted these decisions and regulations. But now we're taking economic decisions and saying the very people who supported the policy decision or advised government to say we need to protect lives and act urgently are now being criticized to say you're not staying in your lane. My understanding is they are exactly in their lane. They are saying what is motivating decisions that have no basis currently available on the medical science for medical decisions, because we're talking about a pandemic. We're not talking about depriving people of economic rights and rights of choice and other choices, because we don't want to get to that level. And again, I won't go into a legalistic discussion, but when we talk, for example, in negotiation theory, negotiation science, you speak about the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which means there's engagement. There's robust discussion and explanation, and there's a discussion of saying, if we talk about power, which is the outer circle of negotiation, you then have the inner circle of rights, and then the most important one is serving interests. We do know government has the power and the decision-making authority to do exactly what it's doing. We then have a circle of saying the government has a right to make certain policy decisions, but so do individuals and citizens in the country. And then we get to the most important part. Whose interests are we serving? My understanding is the policy decisions that were made using the power within the rights that we have and rights that are being curtailed is to protect lives, protect people. But the challenge and the question we find in a context in South Africa and potentially the rest of Africa is, as long as we have lockdowns, and I agree it's very necessary, the question is when we adjust is a policy decision that government is making, is if people on the breadline and don't have food and basic necessities, those social determinants of healthcare, they don't have fresh, clean drinking water, they don't have good food to consume, they don't have good nutrition, is it worse off to die out of poverty and malnutrition and related other chronic healthcare diseases that rely on having good nutrition and a good, at least a supportive environment, or to run the risk of dying from a COVID crisis? I'm not saying I have the right answer, but I'd like you to share with me what your thoughts are. Where do we find that balance? Because I still subscribe to the school of thinking of saying this is a healthcare concern. The declaration of disaster is based on a healthcare need to protect the people of our country. The president then also says we need to use masks. I had said in early March with our colleagues, which you'll find on my previous videos, saying, although government says using masks is not necessary, I thought it was good practice because it's based on good science to limit your risk of exposure to other individuals and contracting what may be aerosolized in your immediate environment that you may be traveling in or in some contact, although with social distancing with individuals. Because as we know, if somebody sneezes, it goes far more than 1.5 to 2 meters in the air. And you can also pick it up from various surfaces because it makes you wearing a mask makes you acutely aware of the risks that you run and to make you aware not to touch your mouth and nose and eyes. So there are decisions being made. 100% of them, in my understanding, has been based on the needs of healthcare to reduce the risks of the spread of this pandemic exploding. Statistics I've seen as late as this weekend is the Actuarial Society of South Africa is postulating potentially 48,000 deaths in South Africa. Other authorities are saying hundreds of thousands. Government, rightfully so, is saying we haven't reached the peak as yet. I agree with that. When it will reach, we don't know. Between now, July and December, could be any time. But that's being informed by the experts who are leading the advisory committees, because that is why they're considered experts. They've done this for decades. They continue to do it for decades. Us as clinicians contribute to those processes and those conversations and share information with our peers. I've had hundreds of conversations with peers who are non-medical in sharing some of my understandings and interpretations. But it begs the question again, what is the basis of the decisions being made? I'd love your input and love your feedback, because I do believe as citizens we're entitled to understand these reasonings. We're entitled to understand why these decisions are being made for us. I know the president is making regular feedbacks, but I'd like to understand, where's the science? Where's the science of deciding what t-shirt I might wear? Where's the science in deciding whether I can buy a cargo pants? And where's the science deciding what I consume and when I consume it? Because I want to see the link of those decisions and those products directly so on scientific fact to the COVID-19 and corona crisis. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Again, stay safe, follow the rules again, even though we may have questions around some of the policy decisions, follow the best practices, wear a mask, social distancing, keep the right distancing, limit your travels only to necessary travels outside of your home, family environment, unless you're an essential services worker, and even in that context, sanitize as often as you can with the good hand products or wash your hands as often as possible. Stay well and stay safe.